Boy.
Hey, Adish.
Hello.
Hey.
You're here early.
I had to make sure it was going to work.
No, that's good. That's good.
See, Yocheved, who's also on here.
Yeah. Yo, hi.
Yocheved checked it this morning.
Yeah.
And something wasn't right.
Oh.
I don't know.
I tried from the information.
Right. From you can't.
And that doesn't work.
Right. Okay. Wow. We're like in the. Yocheved, where are you?
She's at work. She's working at, where are you?
Bikkur Cholim.
Bikkur Cholim. Wow. Oh, that's perfect. For the Shiur on Bikkur Cholim. We're straight from the hospital Bikkur Cholim. Hi, Steve.
Hello.
There we go. Okay, so I'm recording this for everybody that can't make it live. No problem. Okay, so welcome everyone. You can see, hi there, Shauna. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to this Savta Shiur. So it started out, actually, my Savta's Yortzeit was today, was Tu B'Shvat. And I actually started giving a shiur on her Yortzeit, on her first Yortzeit. My mother and I just learned together in her memory. And I've tried every year since to give a shiur on her Yortzeit. And this year I was talking to Debbie, and one year I actually did go to Gitel for Savta Klaff's Yortzeit. And gave a shiur in her memory. And Debbie said, oh, that would be really nice if you did that on Zoom. I said, well, we can put them all together. And then Debbie also realized that it's her, oh, you know what, I'll go through so these are the 4 Savtas, and I'm gonna say something about each one of them first. So this is my Savta, Minette Schwartz Radin Kochman. She was the daughter of Loois and Bertha Schwartz. And today, Tu B'Shvat was her 6th Yortzeit. And yeah, she was my mother's mother. And we were very close. This is actually a picture from my wedding. And I have really lots of wonderful memories with her. And I enjoyed sharing those memories with my kids today.
Her grandmother, I guess.
This is my grandmother, yes.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm gonna just mute everybody for quiet, but you can unmute yourselves if you have questions. Okay, now, okay, Debbie, do you want to say something about your mother? Wait, let me unmute you. Let's see. There we go.
I did it.
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, so you'll see my mother's Yortzeit is Yud Zayin, which is Shabbat. And when one of my friends realized that it was Yud Zayin 17th, she said, that's the gematria like for Tov, good. And that personifies my mother, how she was always just so good and positive. And we were lucky to have her live with us for a long time, and maybe 20 years. And my children grew up with the Savta in the house, as I did. Like you'll see my grandparents lived with us because out of their 7 children, we were the only Orthodox. And so we were fortunate, I was fortunate to have a grandmother in the house. And as they say, when there's a Savta in the house, there's a bracha in the house. And we really felt that. So that's what I have to say.
Well, and you can keep going about your Savta.
Oh,
so this is
and me, I'm lucky to have grandchildren next door and not too far away in Gitel.
So the next Savta is Sadie Jaffe, who was Debbie's Savta. And there's actually a picture of Debbie's mother and her grandmother over here, you see on the right. And her 54th Yortzeit was this month. So it's also in her memory. And as I mentioned at the beginning, when we gathered all these Savtas, I also want to dedicate this to my Savta-in-law, Ya'nטי גיטל bat Shmuel Zev ושפרינצה, whose second yahrzeit is coming up at the end of the month on the 29th of Shvat. So in memory of all these wonderful women and Savtas, we are going to learn together tonight. So take this away. Oops, stop share. Okay. So the topic of the shiur tonight is Bikkur Cholim, visiting the sick. And I didn't even plan this, but one of our participants is Yocheved Schreier, who is a nurse at Bikkur Cholim Hospital in Jerusalem. And so, as we know, Bikkur Cholim is it's a mitzvah that, on the one hand, we know it's a mitzvah. On the other hand, it's something that we would do. I mean, it's just natural. It's natural that we visit the sick, that we take care of others, that we take care of our sick people. On top of this, it's a very big mitzvah. So, and tonight I want to explore some of the sources that tell us about this mitzvah. So I put together a lot of sources. I don't think that we're going to go through every single one. But they're sort of there also for me to stay on track and remember what I'm supposed to be talking about. I put together this source sheet on Sefaria, which I'm going to share my screen, but I'm also going to send everyone a link in the chat so you can open the source sheet if you'd like. Most of the sources appear in Hebrew and English. There's a couple of sources towards the end that are only in Hebrew, and I actually started translating them myself. And then I said, you know what, we're not really going to read them in depth, and I'm just going to translate them aloud when we get to them. I sort of want to start with the question of, so how do we know that Bikkur Cholim, that visiting the sick, is a mitzvah? Like I said, it's something that we would do anyway, but how do we know it's a mitzvah? And I think most of us have in our consciousness that it's a mitzvah because we say so every morning in davening. So now I am going to share my screen here. There we go. So I'm trying to be able to see my text and see you at the same time because it's nice to see all these faces here with me. Okay, so everyone should be able to see my screen, but I want to put it, let's see, do you see that better? Okay, so this is our source sheet. Our first source is from davening. In every morning in brachot, we say, Elu dvarim she'en lahem shiur, ha'pe'ah va'bikurim va'irayon u'gmilut chasadim v'talmud Torah. So these things have no measure. You can do there's no minimum amount and also no maximum amount. And that's pe'ah, leaving a corner of the field for the poor, and the bikurim, the first fruits, and the rayon is the special korban that you would bring in the Beit HaMikdash, and gemilut chasadim, which is all kinds of kindness towards other people, and learning Torah. And then there's another list. Elu dvarim she'adam ochel perotehem be'olam hazeh, v'hakeren kayemet le'olam haba. These are the list of things that a person reaps the rewards in this world, and he gets also interest in the world to come. The Elohen, and these are the things: kibud av ve'em, ugmilut chasadim, v'hashkamat beit hamidrash shacharit v'arvit, v'hachnasat orchim, ubikur cholim, v'hachnasat kala u'vayat hamet v'iyun tefila, v'haba'at shalom ben adam l'chavero u'ben ish le'ishto v'talmud Torah k'neged kulam. So this long list of things. I'm not going to translate it because you have all the English on the side. What I want to note here actually is, first of all, gemilut chasadim, being kind to people, appears in both lists, both something that has no measure and also something where you get rewards in this world and the world to come. And this list also includes Bikur Cholim. Now, why did I bring as a source? Most of my sources are going to be from the Gemara, from Halacha. Why am I bringing a source from the Siddur? What's very, very interesting about this source, which I only found after I started researching it, was if you see over here in the English, they actually quote the Mishnah in Pe'ah and the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat. So this is really a Vברta. It's a Tanaitic saying, and there's one version in the Mishnah and Pe'ah, and actually in that version, Bikkur Cholim is not mentioned. Then in the version in Masechet Shabbat of a similar Vברta, Bikkur Cholim is mentioned, but some of the other things are not mentioned. So what we're actually reading in the Siddur is an amalgamation of the two Vbraitot put together. So if we were going to be doing a textual study, actually in the first version of this source sheet, I brought both sources, the Mishnah and Pe'ah and Masechet Shabbat, but we're not doing a textual analysis of the two things, but it was just something interesting I found out. Something I do want to sort of have in mind as we go through the sources, though, is that Bikkur Cholim is singled out, also Hachnasat Orchim and Hachnasat Kala. These are all things that could be in the category of Gmilut Chasadim, of nice things that we do for people, but they're also considered mitzvot, standalone mitzvot on their own. And as sort of not really an aside, but another thing that I'm going to try to do in this shiur is show you how things are brought down lahalacha. We're now going to look at a couple of different Gemarot. The Gemarot, the Talmud, which was written down around 500 CE, which is commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written down around 200 CE. And then based on the Talmud, there are halachic decisors who set down Jewish law. And we generally can open up a book of Jewish law and find out the details of a particular mitzvah, of how we do things. And the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim is very interesting because it doesn't actually start with a pasuk. It doesn't start in the Torah. It's not written in the Torah anywhere, you must visit the sick. Instead, the rabbis sort of extrapolate it from different things. So the first source from the Talmud that we're going to look at is a Talmud in Sotah. The tractate of Sotah. It's not really important why it's brought here. A lot of times when in learning Talmud, the rabbis will start discussing something and then they'll bring a verse. And this verse reminds them of something else and they'll go off and talk about that. So I didn't actually look over here what the context of this discussion is, but some rabbis quote this verse and they say, Amar Rabbi Chama b'Rabbi Chanina, Mai dichtiv, what does the verse mean? Acharei Hashem Elokechem telechu, you should go after God. And so that's a verse in Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy. And they say, is this possible? Is it possible to walk in the path, to walk after God? Halo ne'amar, they have another verse that they quote, also in the book of Deuteronomy, Ki Hashem Elokecha esh ochlahu, that God is a fire. So you can't get near fire. How can you possibly walk after God? And I think the underlying question here is, how can a mortal even come close to God? Like, what's the point of this kind of trying to even compare humans to God? So they go on to explain, no, the point of the first verse is that we should follow in God's ways, his attributes. So, El Achar Midotav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Mahu Malbish Arumim, in the same way that he clothed the naked. How do we know that he clothed the naked? So we have a verse from Genesis, from Bereshit, Vayas Hashem Elokim la'adam u'li'ishto ktonet or. In the Garden of Eden, God made for man and his wife clothing. And he dressed them. So you too should clothe the naked. Hakadosh Baruch Hu Bikkur Cholim dichtiv vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamre. So we also know that God visited the sick. How do we know this? Because God, the verse in Bereshit, in Parshat Vayera, says that God appeared to Abraham in Elonei Mamre. And this was immediately following the command for Abraham to circumcise himself. So we know that Abraham, and subsequently the Psukim say that it was the third day after the circumcision, and they learned from this that on the third day is when it hurts the most, and so Abraham was in the most pain, and God visited the sick. So Afata Bikkur Cholim. So you too should visit the sick. So based on this story of God visiting Abraham after the circumcision, we learn that we should also visit the sick. And bichlal, the whole idea of gemilut chasadim, of doing kindness, is a way to emulate God. So that's one way of explaining the basis of this mitzvah. Okay. So one way we're going to learn about the details of the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim is to look in places in Tanakh where we have sick people. So the first sick person that we see is Abraham, who undergoes circumcision. Another place that I actually didn't bring a source for this because I didn't find the exact source I was looking for, but another example is with Yaakov. One of the Midrashim says that Yaakov was actually the first person who died of an illness, like he actually got sick. And in the Psukim over there, it says Yosef brought his two sons. Yosef heard that Yaakov was sick, and he brings his sons. So that's another example of Bikkur Cholim in the Mikra. And then the next source is a very, very interesting story. I sort of cut part of this story. This is a story in Masechet Brachot, in the Tractate of Brachot, and it's describing the illness of King Chizkiyahu. It's a much longer passage, and I just kind of picked out passages that are going to be relevant for us, but it's an interesting thing to look at over there. So the story goes, the way that the Gemara tells it, Hevi Yisurim al Chizkiyahu. So God brings an illness, Yisurim, suffering, onto Chizkiyahu the king. The Amar lo li Yeshayahu. So God says to Yeshayahu, the Navi, here, Lech uvaker et hacholeh. So this is a directive of God. It's not in the Psukim. There's no pasuk where God appears to Yeshayahu and says, go visit Chizkiyahu because he's sick. What does the pasuk actually say? The pasuk says, Bayamim hahem chala Chizkiyahu lamut. Vayavo elav Yeshayahu ben Amot hanavi vayomer elav ko amar Hashem tzvakot tzav levetecha ki met ata velo tichya. So Yeshayahu is not very comforting here. He appears to Chizkiyahu, the sick king, and he says, God commanded me to say to you, get your affairs in order because you're going to die. And I don't know and from this, they learned that God told Yeshayahu, go visit Chizkiyahu. And then they have this whole long discussion. And towards the end of the discussion, Chizkiyahu says to Yeshayahu, Kach mekublani mi beit avi ava, afilu cherev chada munachat al tzavaro shel adam, al yimna atzmo min harachamim. So Chizkiyahu says, this is the tradition that I have received from my father's father, meaning David HaMelech. David HaMelech was the master of prayer. He wrote much of Tehillim, and we know that we say Tehillim in times of trouble. And Chizkiyahu is saying, even if there's a sharp sword rests upon a person's neck, he should not prevent himself from praying, from begging for mercy. So basically, Chizkiyahu is saying to Yeshayahu, I know you think that I'm going to die, but this is really the time for prayer. And then it goes on a little longer, and on the next page of the Gemara, it says that Chizkiyahu turned his face to the wall and he prayed. And ultimately, his prayer was answered. So I brought this source for a couple of reasons. It could be an example of what not to do when you're visiting the sick. I mean, Yeshayahu doesn't seem very sympathetic here, but it also shows the power of prayer. And this is the place that we find really a connection between prayer and the sick. It's not the best example because in this case, the sick person is praying for himself. And what we're going to see as we go through the halachic sources is that one of the main purposes of visiting the sick is to pray for them and to really pray on their behalf, which is not what Yeshayahu was doing. And it's what Chizkiyahu is actually telling him, this is what you should be doing. We should be praying at this point. Actually, as I'm talking, it sort of reminded me that the first source, so I'm sort of organizing things as I go along. Wait, what's the next one? Here, we'll read the next source and then I'll get to one of my points. Okay, the next source is another more psukim about God and sick people. So this is from Masechet Shabbat. Says Da'amar Rav Anan Amar Rav. So the Rav Anan said in the name of Rav, Minayin Shakadosh Baruch Hu Soed et HaCholeh. How do we know that God cares for the sick? So they bring another pasuk here. This is actually a verse from Psalms, from Tehillim. It says, Shene'emar Hashem yisadenu al eres dvai. Eres dvai is a bed of illness, but it really has the connotation of somebody who's really about to die. And God is supporting him. So Tanya Namihachi, there's a Vברta that says something in a similar vein. Hanichnas levaker et hacholeh. Lo yeshev lo al gabe mita velo al gabe kisei ela mitatef v'yoshev lefanav mipnei sheshchina lemala mirashotav shel choleh. So this means that when a person goes to visit the sick, he should not sit on his bed, meaning he shouldn't sit above the sick person, because there's this idea that the Shekhinah, God's presence, is actually there in the sick room with the sick person, and it's sort of hovering above the head of the sick person. So therefore, and they know this from the Vברta quotes the same pasuk. It says Hashem yisadenu al eres dvai. So God is on the sick bed, and therefore we shouldn't sit on the sick bed. We should sit lower than the sick bed. But this also is a very important point, that God's presence is there in the room with the sick person. Okay. Right, the end of that was, okay. So what I wanted to sort of piece together, and that third, this idea that God's presence is with the sick person, I saw it somewhere in relation to Yaakov, and that somehow that was, but I couldn't find the exact source for that. So that's why I sort of left that out. But from these three sources, we can see about Bikkur Cholim that we have three sources, so I'll say there's three elements, but it's really two elements and two are connected. One thing is that a main goal of visiting the sick is to care for them. both in the first source and the third source, God is caring for the sick. So with Abraham, we all know the story of Abraham, that God wants to take care of him. He made it a very hot day so that no guests would come, to try to keep Abraham from having to do anything. Abraham wanted guests anyway. But basically, God's point in visiting the sick was to provide for his needs, and also to give him what we call nachat ruach, to make him feel better. That is a main point of visiting the sick. And also another major component in the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim is praying on behalf of the sick person. And the fact that God's presence is there hovering over the sickbed lends to the prayer, that praying in the presence of the sick person actually may be more readily answered because God's presence is very close. So in the halachot that we're going to see, there's both of these elements: caring for the needs of the sick person, as well as praying for the sick. Now, all over the Gemara, there are many, many stories of people going to visit sick rabbis, healing them. There's lots and lots of sources. In my research, I kept coming across this section in Masechet Nidarim. So Nidarim actually has to do with vows, and one can vow not to have anything to do with someone else. So this discussion comes up because if you took that kind of a vow, can you still go visit the sick person? Like if you vowed not to have anything to do with Eddie and Eddie gets sick, can you do the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim? Can you go visit him? And so there's all kinds of interesting discussions that come up around that question. And they bring this one story which illuminates many of the details that we find in the halacha of Bikkur Cholim. So Rav Chelbo, okay, why didn't I not? Here, I didn't cut out the beginning what I meant to. Okay. I'm starting over here. Kach haya ma'aseh b'talmid echad mitalmidei Rabbi Akiva shechala. So once there was a student of Rabbi Akiva who got sick. Lo nichnasu chachamim levakro, and nobody came to visit him. None of the chachamim came to visit him. None of the rabbis came to visit him. V'nichnatz Rabbi Akiva levakro, and Rabbi Akiva went to visit him. Ubeshvil shekibdu v'ribtu lefanav chaya, and Rabbi Akiva made sure, he instructed everybody there to clean the house, to sweep and sprinkle water. Like they had dusty floors. So the way they would do it was they would sweep and then they would sprinkle water on the dust so that the dust wouldn't get everywhere. So, and he said, do that for this student. Amar le Rebbe hechitani. And the student got better and he came to Rabbi Akiva and he said, Rabbi Akiva, because you swept my floors or you told people to sweep my floors, that's what made me get better. You revived me. Yatsa Rabbi Akiva v'darash. So after this experience, Rabbi Akiva went out and said, Kol mi she'en mevaker cholim ki'ilu shofech damim. So this really lends a lot of weight to the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. Rabbi Akiva says, if you don't go and visit the sick, it's as if you're spilling blood. And how much more so if you do visit the sick, it's like you're reviving somebody, bringing them back to life. Ki ata ravdimi amar, kol hamivaker et hachole gorem lo sheyichye. So Rav Dimi comes from Eretz Yisrael to Babel. So he had heard Rabbi Akiva say this, and he says he's instructing the people of Babel, anyone who goes and visits the sick causes the sick person to live, and anyone who doesn't go and visit the sick causes him to die. So then I left it in here, but the discussion of does he really cause him to die or not, that's not the point here. The point is, I'm skipping like 2 lines. So the point is that when you go and visit the sick, you pray for them and then they live. And the person who doesn't actually visit the sick, this is the last line, kol she'en mevaker choleh, en mevakesh alav rachamim, lo sheyichya velo sheyamut. If the idea here is if somebody doesn't go and visit the sick person, then they're not going to daven for them. And the davening is the important part here. So it's not if you don't go and visit the sick person, then they're going to die, but you'll have maybe less motivation to daven for the person. So again, from this story, we see the 2 components of visiting the sick. We see taking care of their physical needs, making sure that they're living in a clean house, that all their physical needs are taken care of, and also davening for the person. So these are the 2 components of visiting the sick. And then earlier in Nidarim, we have another idea that you may have heard of before. Amar Rabbi Acha bar Chanina, kol hamivaker choleh notel echad mishishim b'tzaro. That anyone who comes and visits a sick person, he takes away 1/60th of his suffering. And then they go on a particularly Talmudic discussion to say, well, if one person takes away 1/60th, then why don't we bring 60 people and he'll be completely healed? And they say, no, it doesn't work that way. It's like it takes away 1/60th of the suffering that's left. But basically, this is some kind of mystical idea that a person who comes to visit has the power to remove part of the illness. And I'm going to save sort of some of the discussion of this for a little bit later, because this is a really interesting idea that some people take to very different kinds of extremes. Okay, so that's our sort of overview of the Tannaitic and Amoraic texts, basically until about 500 CE. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this point before we move to the halachic codices? Anybody?
Well, I just wanted to point out that it's very interesting because of now in Corona, like we can't really do Bikkur Cholim.
Right. Well, I'm sort of getting towards that point. Like I didn't want to put it in the title because I didn't know what I could promise. But I have some interesting ideas of how to apply this in times when it's dangerous for us or for the sick person to do visiting in person. But it's interesting that you point that out because nothing said here explicitly, but there is this idea that going to visit the sick means physically with your body. Like you have to be in the, like we did see that the Shekhinah is in the same room as the sick person. So there is this idea that we need to physically go and be near the sick person to do the mitzvah. But maybe not. Maybe there are, or at least there's parts of the mitzvah that you can do that you don't have to be in the same physical space as the sick person. But that's an excellent question, and that's something that I've been thinking about as I've been going through these sources. So now what I want to do is explain a little bit about halachic sources. So when we talk about like a book of halakha, nowadays, like, I don't know, a lot of people will open up something called Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which was written in the 19th century and basically summarizes most practical laws that we would need in our day-to-day living. And it's it's basically a summary of something like the major work of Jewish halakha is called the Shulchan Aruch, which was written in Tzfat by Rav Yosef Karo in the 16th century, around about 1550. Now, Rav Yosef Karo but based himself on other halachic works. And generally, when you read the other halachic works also that he based himself on, you'll see about the same thing. There's not like huge differences. What I found with Bikkur Cholim, because it's a mitzvah, but it's also gemilut chasadim, and it's also a good thing to do. And it has all these interesting stories in the Gemara. The different halachic books actually present it slightly differently. So that's why we're going to look at some halachic works that we might not generally look at, and we'll see. I sort of picked, some of the things they say are, all of them say exactly the same thing, so it's not interesting to read all of them, but I'm going to pick some different ones. So we'll sort of highlight how different people present halakha. So first, we are going to look at the Rambam. So the Rambam, Maimonides, lived in the 12th century. He started out in Spain, and he ended up in Egypt. And he wrote the first major work detailing all of the laws in the Torah. And he calls it the Mishneh Torah. And he is very, very organized and puts everything in lots of details. And it's very interesting that he puts the halachot of visiting the sick together with the halachot of mourning. And he actually doesn't have an extensive discussion of these halachot. The first halakha, he says here, Mitzvat aseh shel divreihem levaker cholim. So he's very clear that this is a rabbinic mitzvah. It is not a Torah mandated commandment. There's differences between rabbinic mitzvot and Torah command, like things that are d'oraita, that are commanded by the Torah. And Bikkur Cholim clearly falls under the category of a rabbinic mitzvah. And also, it's the same category as also comforting mourners, and basically all of those things that we read from the Siddur. All of those things are in this list. And so ve'eluhen gemilut chasadim shebegufo she'en lehem shiur. Right? All these mitzvot that don't have a shiur, so he lists all of them. Right. So what's very interesting about him is he says, "Afa pisha kol mitzvot elu midivrehem, harehen bichlal v'ahavta l're'acha kamocha." So we did not see this in any of the Gemara that we wrote. Like we heard about gemilut chasadim, that it's because we're walking in God's ways, or things like that. And the Rambam says all of these mitzvot of gemilut chasadim, of being kind to others, their basis, they're rabbinic commandments, but their basis in Torah is from the verse, you should love your neighbor as yourself. So anything that you would want to be done to you, you should do to your fellow man. So Bikkur Cholim falls under that category. Okay, so that's the basis for the halakha. And then he says, these are some of the details. And what I wanted to point out here, okay, so we said this is a mitzvah that has no minimum or maximum. It has no measure. So the Rambam says, "Umevakrim harbe pamim b'yom." You could go lots of times in a day. Each one is a separate mitzvah. V'chol hamosif mishubach. The more you do it, the better. Ubilvad shelo yatriach. As long as you're not troubling the sick person, because it defeats the purpose. If you're trying so hard to do a mitzvah, but you're bothering the person that you're supposed to be visiting, then you completely miss the point of the mitzvah. And he also, the Rambam does bring down the halakha, v'chol ha'mevaker et hacholeh ki'ilu natal chelek micholyo v'hekel me'alav. So we saw in the Gemara that you take 1/60th of his illness. So the Rambam also says, yeah, if you come and visit the person, you take away some of his illness. So he also brings what Rabbi Akiva said, lahalacha, if you don't go and visit, it's like you're killing.
I didn't look, Boaz. I'm listening to a shiur.
Wait, Shauna, you turned yourself on and I can't find a way to turn yourself off. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Okay, now we're going to move to the next halachic source, who is the Tur. I wrote it down over here. Rav Yaakov ben Asher. He wrote this between 1300 and 1340 in Spain. So, the Tur divides all of halacha into 4 sections. The sections of Orach Chaim is your daily life. Yoredeya has to do with things that are permitted and things that are forbidden, like kashrut, and mostly kashrut, and also hilchot avilut are in Yoredeya. Chosh and mishpat is the 3rd section, which is all kinds of monetary laws. And Even Ha'ezer, which is all kinds of laws pertaining to marriage and divorce and things like that. So the Tur was the first person to make that 4-part distinction. And later on, the Shulchan Aruch took that same format when he wrote his halachic work. Now, one of the reasons that we base ourselves on the Shulchan Aruch and not on the Tur directly is because, for one thing, the Shulchan Aruch took the Rambam into consideration. Like he based himself on the Rambam and the Tur and the I'm going to get confused because I didn't prepare all this, but basically also the Tur is less organized than the Shulchan Aruch. We're going to see the Shulchan Aruch in a minute, but the Tur goes off on a little bit more tangents. It's not nearly like reading the Gemara, but it's not as concise as the Shulchan Aruch itself. And here, though, it's quite interesting what he brings. So this is his. First of all, the halachot of Bikkur Cholim are in section 335 of the Tur, and he titles it Hilchot Bikkur Cholim V'Refuah V'Notel Lamut. So he has halachot for visiting the sick, also for healing the sick. There's halachot for doctors, and special halachot for somebody who's about to die. And all of these halachot immediately precede the laws of mourning. So it's not so far removed from the Rambam, who included visiting the sick in laws of mourning, but they get their own section now. Okay, so the Tur presents it like this. He says, "V'kevan shechala adam mitzvah al kol adam levakro." So when a person falls ill, it's a mitzvah on every other person to come and visit him. Sheken matzinu bakadosh baruch hu shemevaker cholim. So he clearly says the basis for this mitzvah is because God visited the sick. K'mo shedarshu b'pasuk vayira elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei. So as we read in the pasuk about Abraham, that God appeared to him in Elonei mamrei. Milamed sheba elav levaker hacholeh. V'samchuhu akra. So God visited the sick, and we base it on this pasuk. Based on another pasuk also, v'hodata lahem et haderech yelchu ba. So this was a Gemara that I spared you. It's a different drasha on a pasuk that because why are they trying so hard? Because these are rabbinic mitzvot, but they have to anchor them in some pasuk from the Torah. And the reason that they can't anchor it completely in Breshit is because we know that the mitzvot were only given to us after Breshit. So they need to find another pasuk that refers to Bikkur Cholim in some way. So this is another pasuk that they find that you shall show them the path where they shall walk. And where they shall walk is walking to visit the sick. So Yelchu ba u'mitzvah gedolah hi levaker. Shemitoch kach yivakesh alav rachamim. So this is really the point that I wanted to see here. Because you go and visit them, you'll pray for them. You'll pray for the sick person. ונמצא כאילו מחיה אותו. וגם מתוך שרואהו מעיין בעניינו, אם יצטרך לשום דבר, משתדל בו להמציאו לו, ועושה שיכבדו וירבצו לפניו. So the tour gets to the point here. He says that first you should pray for the person. Going to visit the person will awaken this desire to pray for them. And also, you're going to go see the person. You see what kind of shape he's in. You ask about him. You are interested in what's bothering him, and ask if he needs anything. And you should try to get those things for him, including cleaning. So the English translation here, the English translation was not available. So I actually wrote this translation. And that's why the English is going to stop in a minute, because so then I found there's of course commentaries on, we're Jews, we see something and we have to have comments on it. So on the tour, there is a commentary called the Prisha. The Prisha was written by Rav Yoshua Falk, who lived between 1590 and 1620 in Poland. I think that's when he wrote it. That's not when he lived. And he comments on the tour. So there's actually I started doing this translation and then I stopped, because basically what he goes into the point here, I'll read it and just translate it aloud. Because he grasps on this idea of the cleaning, of the sweeping and the cleaning, and because he says in our days, he's the one who brings this phrase of nachat ruach. You should calm his spirit. You should give him whatever he needs to make him happy, to make him relaxed. And also to pray for them. He says it even more strongly. If you don't pray for the sick person, you didn't do the mitzvah. And he also goes on to say that you yourself don't have to clean the person's house, but you should just make sure that their needs are taken care of. And he also says, "Efshar lomar gam bizmanenu da'ato shel adam tzalul v'nochat tzvei shehabayit naki v'gam ruach ra'ah shora al makom mi'us." In our days, we might not have the same kind of sweeping and that they mention in the Gemara, but a person is definitely more relaxed in a clean setting when their house is clean. And also that bad spirits hang around disgusting places. So you should make sure that the sick person has a clean house. And it's particularly important for a sick person to stay away from any kind of ruach ra or any of these things. Another thing that we haven't really talked about yet is how we pray for the sick person. We say, a lot of it, when I first started thinking about the shiur, I was thinking, everybody makes these tehillim groups, and we say lots of tehillim for sick people. And I started thinking about doing a shiur about that, like why do we particularly say tehillim? And anyway, it's a different topic. And but clearly the prayer is a large component of visiting the sick here. And the Prisha notes that when we pray for the person, not just the Prisha, the Torah says it, that when we pray for the sick person, we say, B'toch Cholei Yisrael. We are praying for an individual person, but in all of the different mishaberachs that we do, and we're always we always want to pray for the person among all the other sick people in Israel. So Peresh Rashi, Shemitoch sheklalo im acherim tfilato nishmat bizchutan. Because we include him with a collective, with a tzibur, with other people, so the prayer is more readily answered because of their schuyot, because of their merits. Because if you have it's the same reason that one of the reasons we pray in a minyan or we pray in a tzibur is because we hope that the collective merits, the merits of the collective, of the group, will serve us better than an individual standing alone. So the same way with sick people is that we want to include everybody together, hoping that all of our merits will answer our prayers. Okay. So that's why we pray for the sick in among other sick people. Okay, so now in our chronological order, we've gotten to the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch, like I said, you'll see he takes the same categorization as the Torah. So you'll find visiting the sick in Yoredea 335. He has 10 halachot of visiting the sick. I'm not going to bring all of them here. We're going to look at specific ones. And I also cut some of them. And also the translation in, I'm not sure where the translation in Sefaria comes from because it includes a lot of explanation. So I cut out a lot of the explanation, but I left some of it in because it's kind of interesting. So first of all, the Shulchan Aruch also says Mitzvah levaker cholim. I cut out the rest of this halacha, but it's interesting to note that he does not bring any psukim. One of the reasons I wanted to show you the Rambam and the Tur was because they do go out of their way to bring psukim to prove this is a mitzvah. By the time we get to the Shulchan Aruch, he says it's a mitzvah. The end. I don't have to bring you any psukim to prove this. Then he goes into some of the details. So I didn't bring all of the Gemarot. All of the halachot that he has here are based on Gemarot somewhere. So this halacha daled, the fourth halacha, says, Ein mevakrin hacholeh b'shalosh shaot rishonot shel yom, mipnei shekol choleh mekel alav cholyo b'boker, v'lo yachush levakesh alav rachamim. So you should not go and visit the sick in the first 3 hours of the day, because all sick people they do better in the morning. So, and you'll go and see the person, and you won't need to want to pray for them. You'll think, oh, he's actually doing okay. I don't need to pray for him. And also don't go in the last 3 hours of the day. Because in the last 3 hours of the day, they get even worse, and you'll go and visit them, and you'll be totally, you'll give up hope. You'll be sort of like Yeshayahu that went to see Chizkiyahu and said, oh, we can't pray for you because you're about to die. So, and I brought this halacha, and what's, we're going to see later on that the specific hours are not actually important. The Shulchan Aruch brings them the halacha because it does say that in the Gemara. But what I want to emphasize here is the effect on the prayer, that when you go and visit the person, it affects how you're going to pray for them. And one of the main points of Bikkur Cholim is to pray for them. So you want to inspire good prayer, not to lose hope and not to think, oh, they're doing fine, there's nothing to pray for.
Wait, Yadika, when did the 3 hours start? Like once he wakes up, I'm like,
no. So whenever I wasn't going to get into it because it's just not our subject. But when halacha talks about hours of the day is divided into 12 halachic hours. So from sunrise to sunset, there's always 12 hours. The length of the hour changes according to the season. So in the winter, a halachic hour would be shorter than 60 minutes. And in the summer, a halachic hour is longer than 60 minutes. but there's always 12 hours. So the shalosh shot rishonot of the 3 first hours of the day are from sunrise for 3 hours. And the 3 last hours of the day would be from sunset, you would count 3 hours back. So basically they're saying go and visit in the middle of the day. But again, we're going to see later halachic authorities say that now it's not relevant, and anyway, hospitals have visiting hours and whatever. But what's interesting here is that the Shulchan Aruch is not saying that the hours matter because you shouldn't bother the sick person. They're saying because you're not going to get effective prayer if you go at those times. And in the smaller letters, you see here, I forgot on our survey of halachic authorities, I forgot to mention that the Rav Yosef Karo is a Sephardic halachic authority, and he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. The Ashkenazi halachic authority at the same time was Rav Moshe Isserlis. I forgot to look him up, but he was somewhere in Europe at the same time as Rav Yosef Karo, and he wrote an entire book, the same type of thing, but Rav Yosef Karo published his Shulchan Aruch first. So Rav Moshe Isserlis, instead of publishing a competing book, instead he has glosses on the Shulchan Aruch. That's what you see here. It says gloss, and in Hebrew, we call him the Mapa. The Shulchan Aruch is a set table, and the Ramah, or Rav Moshe Isserlis, is known as the Mapa, the tablecloth for the table. So he says here, he comments, V'chol shebiker v'lo bikesh alav rachamim lo kiyem et mitzvah. That's something we found in the tour also, that whoever visits the sick and doesn't pray for them didn't do the mitzvah. Okay. This one I'll skip. Halacha Vav was just the same thing that we saw in the Prisha, that you include the sick person in B'chol Cholei Yisrael with all of the other sick people. Now this, we're starting to get closer to our current situation of Corona. He doesn't talk about Corona, but in Siman Chet, in number 8 over here, he says, Ein mivakrin lo lecholi me'ayim velo lechole ha'ayin velo lechole harosh. So don't visit someone with a stomach ailment or an eye ailment or a headache. So these are actually mentioned in the Gemara, but the Shulchan Aruch explains, V'chein kol choli d'takif le alma v'kashe le dibura ein mivakrin oto bifanav. Okay, so right. So I left in the explanation here. Okay, someone who's very sick and it's hard for him to talk. You shouldn't visit him directly in front of him. Ela nichnasin b'bayit hachitzon, but you go to his house, like don't go into his bedroom, but go to his house. V'shoalin v'dorshin bo, and ask about him. How's he doing? Im tzrichim lechabed v'lirbot lefanav, if he needs any house cleaning done. V'chayotze bo, v'shom'in tzaro, and you hear how he's doing, how much in pain he is. U'mevakshim alav rachamim. So, and clearly you need to pray for him. So what's really interesting in the English here, I'm not sure, like all of the italics is not a direct translation. It's an explanation of what's going on here. I don't know where that explanation is coming from. But in the Gemara also, it explains that why shouldn't you visit someone with a stomach ailment? Because it could be embarrassing for them. Like they have diarrhea, they need to go to the bathroom all the time. It's not so comfortable for them to be visited. And also the cholei ayin, cholei rosh, he says anybody who's it's hard for them to talk. So don't go to them and start talking. But you should go and ask about his needs and try to fulfill his needs. And that is something that I think is very, very relevant for today. That's sort of the opening for one thing that I thought was interesting is they don't say anything directly about a contagious illness. I mean, I think at the time they also didn't really have the concept of these are highly contagious illnesses, so it might be dangerous for you to go and visit them. That's not the reason that's given here. It's so that you shouldn't bother them. But
isn't I because of contagious?
No, so that's what I thought also, but it's not. That's not why they say that. It's just because it would be difficult for them to talk, to like look at other people or something like that. I also thought because we know that eye infections are very contagious, but that's not the reason that they give for not going to visit them. So on the one hand, there are people that it says you shouldn't go and visit in person, sort of upholding our idea that the real mitzvah is to go in person. On the other hand, there are things that you can do without being there physically in person. There's plenty of Bikkur Cholim, of taking care of the sick person's needs that you can do without being in person. Now, I know it's getting late and we're really going to finish up. I just wanted to mention a late 19th, early 20th century halachic authority called the Aruch HaShulchan. He's an Ashkenazi authority, and Rav Yechiel Michal Epstein, and he actually lived in Nevardok, which is where my other side of the family, the Lubchanskis, were actually from Nevardok. And something that I've found in my research about my family is that my great-grandfather, Rav Harry Lubchansky, actually had, they call it smicha for shlita. He got his smicha for shlita from Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein. And he really has a really beautiful way of writing these halachot. We are not going to read the whole thing because it's getting late and it's long, but I brought it for a reason. What did I bring it for? He also explains a little more at the end. He's not the only one that brought this, but he also brings it. He says, "Yesh omrim shemi sheyesh lo chole betoch beito, yelech etzel chacham shebair, sheyivakesh alav rachamim v'sheyivarchenu." That someone who has a sick person in their house, like a family member is sick, so the family member should go to the rabbi of the town and ask that the rabbi pray for the sick person. So he brings it here that and that's how the custom got to be, that we pray for the sick person in shul during the Torah reading. Because that's also a time for asking for mercy. And he adds other things. This was also something interesting. He says, "V'yesh mi sherotze lomar dekshehachole b'makom acher lo yitpalel alav." So some people want to say, if the sick person is not in your own city, he's somewhere else, so you shouldn't pray for them. Because maybe he died. Maybe he lives, 3 towns away, and you heard, 2 weeks ago that this guy was sick, but maybe he died already. So the Aruch HaShulchan says, "La'ani utati lo nehira klal." That doesn't wash with me. Sheharei afilu beget machzikin loe b'chayim. So if you get if somebody sends a get, we assume that he's still living. Dirov cholim l'chayim. Most sick people recover. So we assume that if we heard that he was sick 2 weeks ago, we can still pray for him now. V'chol sheken linyan tefillah, and especially for tefillah. V'chen haminhag hapashut ve'en lefakdik klal. Okay, so that's what we said. Now, I remember I said about the taking away 1/60th of the illness. So there's another source that this was just really, really strange a little bit. This is back to the Gemara. The source says, because also at the beginning I said that Bikkur Cholim is sort of a subcategory of Gemilut Chasadim. So this Gemara is actually talking about the pasuk that the Torah brought. Yelchu ze Bikkur Cholim, hainu gemilut chasadim. So if Bikkur Cholim is gemilut chasadim, why do we need to mention both of them? Lo nitracha ela leven gilo de amar mar ben gilo notel echad mishishim b'chol yom va'afilu hachi mibayle lemezal legabe. So I'm going to explain this. There's this idea that this is a little bit more than the 1/60th. Somebody who's ben gilo, it doesn't mean that a person is the same age. It means if a person was born under the exact constellations as the sick person, and that person goes and visits them, like the two people were born at the exact time, the same time of day, the same constellations, and one of them is sick. If the healthy person goes and visits them, he actually takes 1/60th of his illness. It's not that he takes it away, he takes it into himself. So there's actually danger to the visitor. And that's why we need a specific mitzvah for Bikkur Cholim, because even though it's dangerous for the visitor, he's still commanded to go and do this. And I wasn't sure that I was understanding it right, but that's what Steinsaltz says over here also. So I don't know.
That?
Yeah.
You did, excuse me.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You're saying that right after you just finished saying about they didn't really know about contagious diseases.
Right. That was not based on contagious. That was not based on contagion at all. It's if a person was born at exactly the same time as the sick person, they thought that it was some mystical thing. That because they were so close, like as if they're the same person, and he goes and visits, so he takes away 1/60th. So it's not because it's based on contagion or something like that. So yeah, so I'm just sort of going to leave that there. One last thing that I wanted to bring up is a modern day decisor, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who lived in New York. He died in 1986. I actually remember when he passed away because my teacher, Rav Ephraim Greenblatt, studied with him. And when I was in 3rd grade, Rav Moshe Feinstein passed away, and Rav Ephraim told us about him. So after we saw the large halachic works that detail each and every halacha, after those books were established, so then the format of halacha moved over to something called she'elot v'tshuvot. People would write in questions, and the halachic authorities would give answers. So Rav Moshe Feinstein's book of questions and answers is called Igrot Moshe, like the letters of Moshe. And he deals with more modern questions. So one of his is someone who asked a question, B'inyan Bikkur Cholim al yedei telephone. And that's how he spelled telephone. I can actually show you, I can show you the tshuva. It's just really interesting to see it. So, and in his responsa, he deals with the question of, do you need to be physically in the presence of the sick person, because that would prevent you from being able to do the mitzvah over the telephone. And he says that for sure over the telephone, you're fulfilling part of the mitzvah, because for one thing, you'll be able to talk to them. You'll definitely be able to pray for them. You might not be able to see them. Like for him, it's very interesting that actually seeing the sick person is one of the, is a main component of arousing the proper amount of prayer. So, I mean, he didn't know about Zoom. So today I'm thinking like, maybe we could, if he said, yes, you can do it over the telephone, it's not so great. I mean, now we have Zoom. I think though that maybe a sick person would not necessarily want to be on Zoom and would want to turn off the camera. But anyway, that was an idea. If you want, I just wanted to show you the Igros Moshe is not in Sefaria, but just so that you can see what a response.
I don't hear you anymore. How come I don't hear you?
I'm back. Sorry, I muted myself by accident. Moving too many things around on the screen. So this is what a tshuva looks like. So you see, this is, he says, Binyan Bikkur Cholim al yedei telephone. And then this is, it's not a very long tshuva. So anyway, so I think what I just want to close. First of all, I want to close with a tefillah for all of the sick people out there, both people that are ill with corona and other illnesses. I have quite a list of people that I daven for. And we see that actually davening for sick people, even if you're not able to visit them in person, is a large component of that mitzvah. So I would like to offer a tefillah for all of the cholim b'toch shar cholei Yisrael who we are praying for. Would anyone like to say something? Questions, comments?
I have one silly comment.
Yes.
The spelling of telephone in Moshe Feinstein's letter is Yiddish. It's the way they spell it in Yiddish.
Right, right, because that's what, I mean.
The ayin is a segel, right. And the
right.
And
right.
the other thing is, when they say that you should visit the sick person and see him, it's not just so you see him, so you see the circumstances in which he's living. Right. Sometimes you ask someone on the phone how they are, and they say, "Oh, everything's fine. I have everything I need." When you go there and you actually see what's doing, maybe you'll realize the Frigidaire is empty, right. Nobody's cleaning up.
Sure, that's a very important point, and that is something that is hard to do over Zoom. Also, we control our little boxes we see, and that is a very important point. That going in person helps you really understand. Like, there's a lot to be read between the lines, and knowing what a person needs is more effectively done in person than just hearing what they're telling you. That's a very, very important.
Are we mechuyav to daven? You know, today, because of the phones, we get a ton of message daven for him.
Right.
So is it a chiyuv then in that case, like every person you hear?
Well, that's also an interesting case, because I always find it more meaningful to daven for somebody I actually know. And also, like what we were saying is going to see the person arouses proper davening, because if you just get a text message from somebody, you don't know what they're sick with, who the person is. It, like, you can daven for them, but how much meaning are you going to be able to put into it? So knowing someone's circumstances, knowing who they are, knowing what they're sick with, knowing how many kids they have, you know, it brings something extra to your davening. I also don't think that you can be mechuyav to daven for anybody. Like, it's something that comes from you. So, like, on the one hand, we see that there is this mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. Included in Bikkur Cholim is davening for the sick person. So you get a mitzvah to say. It's not something that, like, you know, you have to daven for every single text message you get.
Oh. I have a question. It made it sound like you're supposed to daven when you're doing the Bikkur Cholim.
Yes.
Nobody does. You give them a bracha, but you daven later.
So I'm glad you brought that up, Sheila, because that was something I didn't emphasize enough. Like, the idea that the Shekhinah is in the sick room. So if you're able to offer a short prayer actually in the presence of the sick person, you're right in front of the Shekhinah. So it's sort of like you're going to the Kodesh Kodashim, and it's really an auspicious time for prayer. But the same idea that you go to the rabbi of the shul to get to daven for them. So that's also, so it's gam v'gam, you know, it's not like either or. I think there is like an extra special something to be able to actually daven in the presence of the sick person, because you're davening in the presence of the Shekhinah.
Okay, Yedida?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank all my friends and
Yes.
family who I see here. And my good friend Minnie runs a Tehillim group.
Oh,
And it's very special, very hard thing to do. And Herbie is always taking challah for sick people.
yes.
Now, what is that, minhag?
So that's another minhag. That's another beautiful minhag to take challah. So in the school, like the same way that we said, like when we're davening for a person, we do it b'toch shar cholei Yisrael because we want the merits of everyone to sort of get to go together. So taking challah is a mitzvah. So anytime you do a mitzvah, when you light Shabbat candles, when you take challah, when you go to the mikvah, when you, like, these are all mitzvot that you personally are getting some kind of merit for that. So you're sort of saying, well, I'll take some of my merits and share them with all the sick people. That was another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, is that there's special, you get sort of extra credit for davening for other people. Like we saw that Chizkiyahu davened for himself, but we really rarely see that. We mostly see of people davening for other people. And there's this, I couldn't find the specific source for it, but there's this idea that if you go out of your way to daven for somebody else, then you yourself will be answered. So there's the idea that the same idea of doing lots of mitzvot, of sharing the zchuyot, of sharing the merits of those mitzvot, it gives you more chances of being answered. Yeah. You know what? Let's end with a Tehillim. 1 second. We'll say one Tehillim, and everyone can. I'll pause, and everyone will say for their list of Cholim. 1 second. I'll put it up here. Okay, it's already here. I knew where I was going. Let's see.
Yadira, what about tefillah? What about Tehillim at nighttime for the Cholim these days?
Right. So these days, so that was something that I started to see when I started researching if we're saying Tehillim for sick people. And there also was this idea that you shouldn't say Tehillim at night, or you should say Tehillim at night, and most of the sources that I've seen are that nowadays, whenever somebody really needs tefillot, we daven for them. You can say Tehillim at night. It's okay. Okay, so I'm gonna say this Tehillim, and everybody sees it. You can say it along with me. Shir hamalot mima makim karaticha Adonai. Adonai shim'a bekoli tiyena oznecha kashuvot lekol tachnunai. Im avonot tishmor ya Adonai mi ya'amod. Ki imcha slicha lema'an tivarei. Kiviti Adonai kivta nafshi v'lidvoro hochalti. Nafshi l'Adonai mishomrim laboker, shomrim laboker. Yachel Yisrael el Adonai ki im Adonai hachesed v'harbe imo fudut v'hu yifde et Yisrael mikol avonotav. אז לרפואה שלמה בתוך שאר חולי עמו ישראל.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Yadira.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
And I recorded it, so everybody will. I can send it. I'll send it to everyone later.
Good
Kol
to see
hakavod.
Thank
Send
you.
the link to
Yesh
Matan.
koach.
Thank you from Memphis.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming.
It was very nice.
Thank you.
Have a good Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom, everyone. Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shira.
Shabbat shalom, good
It's
Shabbos.
still,
Shabbos.
Tu B'Shvat.
Right. Still Tu B'Shvat in Memphis.
Happy Yisroel Chag for
Happy Yisroel Chag Tu B'Shvat.
Laila tov.
Laila Tov. So, thanks.
You did it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I really, really enjoyed it. And I have like lots of thoughts, but I'm supposed to go to sleep soon. So
Yeah. Go to sleep.
I'm saying I have lots of thoughts. It's I enjoyed it a lot.
Good, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know there's a way to save the participants list. I keep forgetting to do that. I don't know how to do it.
Indeed, I've been bottling cider
Oh.
this whole time.